Well, good morning. My name is Heidi Sargent. I'm an assistant city attorney with the Seattle City Attorney's Office. I'm a prosecutor, and I'm a liaison from my office to the Seattle Police Department's Vice and High-Risk Victims Unit. And we're now down to the 10,000-foot level here as we look at how to move toward the Nordic model. Because the Nordic model did not happen overnight. It was a journey. It was a process of incremental but profound change that occurred over time. It required a change in cultural norms, in law, in institutions, and in relationships. And in Sweden, it got worse before it got better because they tried the step of legalization in between time, which then they had to reap what they'd sown with that in terms of increased trafficking and increased prostitution. So what we'd like to do is skip that intermediate step, that painful step in the middle, and just skip straight to the Nordic model, but that will take time. It does take time. So in Seattle, we began that change in 2012 with a single step, which was a change in our policy. At that time, we had been prosecuting at a ratio of about 2 to 1, twice as many prostitution crimes as the buying crimes, which we called then patronizing a prostitute. So our goal was simply to reverse those numbers and get to a point where we were prosecuting twice as many of the patronizing cases and half as many of the prostitution cases. And this policy shift was based on a couple of different realizations, which we've touched on in the previous presentations. And that is that, first of all, the historical method of focusing on the prostitution crimes just didn't work. It didn't reduce crime. And we were very interested in reducing the crime because it's a plague on the neighborhoods in Seattle. Prostitution crimes, prostitution-related crimes were increasing, trafficking was increasing in Seattle, and then there's a whole host of sort of satellite crimes that circle around commercial sexual exploitation, especially at the street level on the track, which includes drug crimes, theft, vehicle prowls, and assaults and violent crimes as well. And second, besides the fact it wasn't working, it just was not a just model, we realized, because it wasn't focusing on the harm causers. It was re-victimizing those that had been harmed. So that was our policy. It was very simple. And it had two prongs. First was when we did charge, if we did charge a person with prostitution, our goal would be to divert her into services which hopefully would lead ultimately to exit or make it more possible for her to someday exit. And on the other prong was to hit the demand side hard and charge those crimes whenever they occurred. So we had our policy, and next we had to figure out how to animate it. So the first thing we did was we revised our filing and disposition standards for the charging of these crimes. And in the case of the prostitution crimes, we developed a set of pretty narrow criteria under which we would consider filing charges. It was always discretionary. Just because we met one of these criteria didn't mean we had to do it. But the times when we would consider filing a charge for prostitution was if there had been any violence committed during the commission of the prostitution crime against a witness or against an officer or against anybody. Second would be if the person that we were looking at charging, if there was evidence that the person had engaged in prostitution-related behavior before, and that the city had been engaged in trying to connect that person with services before. So, in other words, not first time only. There had to be a pattern of practice there. Third, if by charging we could provide some needed measure of safety or services to that person. And fourth, if there was some type of coordinated effort between law enforcement and the city attorney's office. Now you see from those last two criteria, they're pretty open-ended, and you could, for example, safety and services needed. You could interpret that in almost any case. But we use that with a lot of discretion and very sparingly. The fact of the matter is that we were not charging on most of the cases that were being referred to us by the police department when we started to implement the policy. But in those cases where we did decide it was a good idea to file a charge, we also decided, we revamped what the disposition, the recommendations that we would be making for these cases would be. And in our court, in Seattle Municipal Court, we have a community court where we sent various types of lower level crimes. And so we diverted, or we made an offer to everyone that was charged with prostitution, the opportunity to go to community court. And there, if they followed certain conditions for a 6-week period, the case would then be, the charge would be dismissed. And this would be true whether the person was charged for the very first time in their life with prostitution, or whether it was the 100th time. So they would go to community court, and they were subject to a small mandatory fine under the RCW and our corresponding ordinance, which was $50, which could be reduced to by a factor of 2/3. And they also had to take a class, they had to have an HIV test, and engage with social service contacts through the Court Resource Center, and commit no more violations during the 6-week period and stay out of the areas of prostitution. After that, they could have the charge dismissed. We also gave an opt-out recommendation if they didn't choose to go to community court, but the conditions were all the same. So there really was no reason for them to, either way they were going to get exposure to the services. On the flip side, if the case was a patronizing case, we would charge that basically whenever the elements for the crime were met. And in every case, eventually we changed our policy to require a plea. Originally we were offering what we call dispositional continuances to first-time offenders, so that they had the charge hovering out there in a state of continuance without ever resulting in a conviction if they did all the requirements. We changed that a couple of years ago to require a plea. And the best offer that they can get is a deferred sentence, which after a year, if they are again our first-time offender and have met all the requirements, we will dismiss the charge, but it will appear on the record as a conviction for a year. Now, the requirements are very stiff if there's a conviction for the sexual exploitation case, which is what we call it now in Seattle. But in addition to having to not commit any more criminal law violations during the period, they're subject to a number of fines. We heard about some of the fines that are from Val Ritchie in his presentation for the CSAM cases, the commercial sexual exploitation of minors. For the commercial sexual exploitation of adults, which is your patronizing crime or sexual exploitation crime, there are also very stiff penalties mandated under the law. For a first-time offender, they're subject to a $1,500 mandatory fine. And like the CSAM fine of $5,000, it's the same split obtains. It's 50% at least to prevention and education for survivors and also for the men, like Peter's class, and 48% for law enforcement to fight this crime. It gets steeper from there if it's a second offense or a third offense. It goes up to $2,500 or $3,500 each subsequent offense. We also in Seattle have another fee, which is $1,000 straight, that is required under our ordinances, which is diverted directly to what we call the Sex Industry Victims Workers Fund. And that provides for services to the prostituted people. In addition, they have to pay for their class, their mandated counseling class. And then we have penalties that are usually involving very steep community service hours if it's a first-time offense, at least 80 and up to 120 hours. And if there's any type of other history at all, then it becomes a jail recommendation as well, or instead of the community service. So what we did after we had our policy and changed our standards for how we would look at these cases in terms of filing them and the recommendations we would make is we worked with the existing laws that we found that we had, which provided us with a lot of tools. There were the fees that I just mentioned, and in addition there were other sources of punishment or deterrence, as well as revenue to self-finance this policy. And that included impound fees. RCW also provides for if the person is driving a car, say it's a street prostitution or street patronizing offense and the person drives their car to commit that offense, that car can be impounded. It can be redeemed, but at the cost of $500, which again comes back and it follows the same ratio of a 50% split to go for services, education type of things, and 48% for law enforcement. And then we also have the seizure laws. Under 9A.88 in the RCW, there's a particular statute for seizures where the crime that's committed is the CSAM, the commercial sexual exploitation, or promoting prostitution in the first degree, which involves coercion, force, and also people with disabilities. So in addition to the $5,000 fine that's mandatory that Val talked about, a person is also subject to having their property seized. So the way that works is, and I'm also the seizure attorney for the Seattle Police Department, so I work with this a lot too. So the way that works is, say you have a CSAM case, and the person has just agreed in texts or whatever, text or email, to with a detective, an undercover detective, to buy sex from an underage person. And they arrange for a time and place, and then they show up in their vehicle. That vehicle can be seized as an instrumentality in the crime. You can also seize the money that they brought. Say they agreed to pay $100 to her. You can take that $100 and also take the vehicle. Then, of course, they can put in a claim for that, and then you have to conduct a seizure hearing to prove that the vehicle is subject to forfeiture. Then, if that vehicle is forfeit, it can be used for law enforcement purposes. So that's another way in which you can use the statutes that exist. Besides vehicles, and besides the specific statute for CSAMs and promoting, there's also the general felony forfeiture seizure statute, which for any felony that's committed, so this does not cover your adult commercial sexual exploitation cases, patronizing. Would have to be some other type of felony that's not covered by the specific statute. But there is the general felony forfeiture statute in which any type of many types of property can be seized and forfeit. And this includes personal property. So for example, you could imagine a situation where there has been an undercover investigation into a particular property, real property, that is being used for the purpose of prostitution, say a brothel. And if you can meet the elements of that and establish, basically it's a requirement of the owner has knowledge. You can seize that real property just as you can a vehicle or cash. And it is also subject to forfeiture. So, of course, there's a high hurdle there. It's a higher hurdle than the other types of personal property seizures and forfeitures, but it's one that can be met if you have the right kind of investigation evidence. And then that property can be used, if it's forfeit it can be converted to cash, or it can be used potentially. Something that I think about is converting a property that was previously used to exploit people and turn it into a service center. So, for the people that have been exploited. So those are some of the existing laws on the books that can be used that are already there. And you can also take a look at your own laws and see if there's anything else that you could add, such as the Victims Fund that we did. You also need to be able to have a source of services. In Seattle, we're fortunate, it's a pretty big jurisdiction. We have quite a bit of money at the human services level and the court, so we have an array of services that we can and do provide. So it's a question of hooking up with those and getting collaboration between the court, prosecutor's office, and your human services department, and possibly with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. In addition to our human services department that provides money to service organizations, we work with NGOs, including OPS, where Peter Quietin is from, another organization called Real Escape from the Sex Trade, which is acronyms REST. They're a facility in Seattle that actually has beds, and you can stay for an extended period if you're a survivor of prostitution. We have another organization that we work with called Aurora Commons, which is right on the track in Seattle, which is on Aurora, where most of our street crime is based for prostitution. It's kind of a drop-in house. It's not open all the time, but it's right in the heart of the worst of it. On the track, most of the women that you see there who are prostituting are homeless, drug addicted, usually heroin, and it's a pretty bad scene. And so having this drop-in center that's non-judgmental, and they cook meals once or twice a week and just hang out. Police check in from time to time in a friendly way. And they work with some of our other key service providers in the city too for prostitution survivors. And we also have, with the YWCA, they have about 3 beds. So those 4 groups that I just mentioned, they actually form a unit called the Adult Survivor Collaborative, which is funded as a group by the City of Seattle to provide these services. So we're fortunate to have that. So after getting your policies in place, your filing and disposition standards, your services, identifying what those are, where they're coming from, it's really about building relationships. Obviously, for the prosecutor's office, we can't do anything. Nothing starts unless we have cases referred to us by the police department. So one of the most key aspects of whatever success we have is a good, strong relationship with the police department, and at least some level of agreement on how to proceed. Anybody in law enforcement will know right away that it's much cheaper, not only is it traditional, to go after the prostitutes rather than the sex buyers. There's various reasons for that, but one of them is just economics. It's much easier and cheaper to go after the women on the street. And here I'm talking about street operations, but really it's any type of operations where what you're going after is the buyer. It tends to be more expensive. So if you just take a street op, for example, if you have what you need to try to arrest a woman that's committing prostitution, is basically one male undercover police officer who just rolls down the street in his vehicle, sees somebody, has an offer and acceptance, and boom, she's under arrest. But to try to identify and arrest the sex buyer is a much more involved and expensive proposition, because the undercover officer that you have is a female, and she needs support. She's at risk because by definition, prostitution is dangerous, and that's recognized. So she's got a whole support team, surveillance officers, arrest officers, that are going, it's like a team of maybe 8 different officers in Seattle usually. So it's much more involved, much more expensive. And then you also have pushback from the community too, because what they see is, on the street, is they don't see the sex buyers. What they see are the prostitutes. And that's what, if they're going to be reacting to what they're seeing in the neighborhood, that's what they're reacting. And so they want to see the police coming out and arresting the women. They don't see the Johns. So that gets to another aspect of relationships that you need to build. You need to build your relationship with your community, and they need to start understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that you're going after the root cause, and it's really more of a long game than a short game. But you've got to have that police cooperation, and they have to have the resources, and Val touched on that a little bit. Some jurisdictions are a lot smaller than Seattle. They may not have a vice unit. They may not have any activity at all for prostitution and sexual exploitation crimes. So it's going to have to come out of control. And they may not have any money for it too. But the beauty of this is that it can be self-financing, as Val touched on and as I've talked more about. You've got to get it started out, but once you do start making arrests of sex buyers, it becomes self-funding, not only for the law enforcement engagement, but also for the services aspect of what you're trying to accomplish. Now, in the case of Seattle, we're fortunate enough to have an actual dedicated person, which is myself, as the liaison to vice and high-risk victims. I'm physically housed with them, and that really helps to continue to further the policy and the relationship and work towards common goals. So that can't always happen, I realize, but If there's somebody that in a prosecution office, for example, that could be dedicated to just even start having the conversations and start forming a relationship with the police department to try to make this happen, that would be helpful. Another thing that we have done as we've tried to implement the policy is to look at the language that we use when we're talking about this. For example, we actually changed our law, the name of our law. It was patronizing a prostitute, like the state law. And a couple of years ago, our city council voted unanimously to change the name of the patronizing law to sexual exploitation. When you're trying to bring about cultural norm change, a very powerful way to help do that is by how you're talking about it and how the law is talking about it. Patronizing a prostitute has a completely different connotation. It's just patronizing. You patronize the arts, and you can patronize a prostitute, and it's labeling the person that you're patronizing. Sexual exploitation is a very powerfully different type of label, and I can assure you that it gets a lot of reaction. People are much more upset to be charged with that crime, just the sound of it. Unfortunately, we couldn't change any of the substance of our law because we would have to do that at the state level first. But some of the things you can also think about for the future are potential changes you might like to see in state law. For example, higher penalties for sexual exploitation, for patronizing a prostitute. Right now, it's a simple misdemeanor. Both of the crimes, prostitution and sexual exploitation, are simple misdemeanors carrying sentences of 90 days and $1,000 maximum, which is significantly less than theft of, say, a sandwich from a deli, which can take a year of your life or $5,000. So that's something to be looked at. In addition, there's often trafficking laws right now. I think there's 6 or 7 that are being entertained in the current session, and one of those is a vacating bill. There's already a law in the books where prostitution convictions can be vacated under certain circumstances, but there's a bill currently, and Robert may be talking more about that. I'm not sure, are you? So those are 2 examples of types of law changes that can be reflective of and begin to produce more cultural change and changing the way people look at this crime by recognizing, like for example, if there were higher penalties for buying than for selling sex, or the ability to change, to vacate your prostitution conviction is helpful on the other prong of our policy, which makes it easier for the person to exit, because without that conviction on their record, then it makes it more possible for them to do things like get jobs and housing. And then just in the way we talk about these crimes, instead of referring to a person who commits a prostitution crime as a prostitute, we've tried to move off of that type of language and call it prostituted people or exploited people. But those kinds of things matter, especially when you're talking to the public or you're talking to the press about it, or even talking to the jury and the court. It creates impressions and it starts to affect change in attitude. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Eurospa, which Val mentioned as an example of one of the operations. Typically at SPD, they do a variety of street operations, which used to be the mainstay before the internet. That's the way that prostitution happened, was on the street. And we still do street operations, but SPD is also now doing a lot of hotel-based operations whereby an ad is placed in a known sex marketing place like Backpage used to be, and then get a hotel room somewhere. It may be in the CD area, or maybe in a high-end hotel, and wait for the texts and calls to come in, and they'll start coming in very rapidly. And that has become a mainstay type of operation too. SPD has tried some other things too, but most recently they participated in what's called the National John Suppression Initiative. It's something that happens twice a year. It's a national initiative, as the name implies, and law enforcement agencies from around the country participate in emphasizing, if only for that time, twice a year, emphasizing their law enforcement efforts on the buyers. And so this most recently we just wrapped one up in January, but the penultimate one we had last fall in September, August time involved this Euro Spa case. And what had happened was SPD had been conducting an investigation into a live massage parlor, an operating massage parlor. At the conclusion of that investigation and bust, which resulted in the shutting down of the massage parlor, the owner of that property had been an innocent owner. She wasn't aware of what the property was being used for. So she was approached and she agreed to let the police use the place as a front for an operation. So the former massage parlor opened under new management, and big banner signs, and open for business. And as Val said, it was open for 8 days. They never dreamed it would last so long. It was open for 8 days and it resulted in 204 arrests. And it's true that sometimes men were being let out in handcuffs, but that was not deterring new customers from coming in and just passing right by. So it was just a constant stream of arrests. And I'm still filing the charges and notes because it resulted in so much volume. And that was a new type of case for us. Some of the it resulted in certain potential new issues being raised, not serious issues for us as prosecutors, but issues from defense. For example, entrapment became more of a bang to drum on, but that's easily addressed. But mostly it was a volume issue. It was a big drain on SPD at the time. It was unexpected, but it's over. It also resulted in a lot of publicity. And Val mentioned that public education is part of what we need to do. It's just this it's a multi-sector approach, but it's also a multi-engagement approach in terms of education. You have to have a lot of people ultimately be on the same page in order to sustain this type of effort. You have to have the people in the neighborhoods that are experiencing the crime understand what you're doing. You have to have the police being on the same page. You have to have your prosecutor being on the same page. You have to have the court, the judge. You don't want to get a conviction and then the court just gives a deferred sentence or something like that. So everybody has to ultimately start looking at it differently than they were before. And the Euro Spa case generated a lot of volume, and it also generated press interest just because of the sheer volume. And while it's good in a certain way to have that press, it also can create difficulties for the police department. A vice unit is essentially an undercover, a unit, and so you're always walking a line between, things that they're good in a way, but harmful in another way. Like press, for example, can actually put a chilling effect on things. The more attention something gets. Eurospa also really generated a lot of interest in the defense bar. Again, just because of sheer volume. I had attorneys, Val mentioned he still has attorneys calling him from the review board cases. I started having a lot of calls resulting from the Eurospa cases just because there were so many new defendants that were dumped onto the sort of defense market all at once. And there were very few attorneys that were dealing with sexual exploitation cases. I'm not aware that there was any kind of specialization in it at all, but suddenly there has become a specialization amongst certain defense attorneys, and different attorneys that had only done other types of work, for example, DUI attorneys, all of a sudden started getting on the bandwagon and taking the cases. And I remember this one long-time DUI attorney saying to me when he called me up, saying, suddenly I find this crime interesting. And maybe it was interesting because it was a new source of income, but he was turning his DUI type of analysis, which is very intensive, onto this crime of sexual exploitation and seeing what he could do with it. I think a case as large as Eurospa generated some very good outcomes in terms of getting guys that were committing this crime, but in terms of deterrent value and also educating the public. But it is an expensive operation, but like I have said before, it could be a self-financing operation. The last thing I'll say before I go to next steps is another couple of areas that we're moving towards, and one is a pre-charge diversion program where we reduce the times that we even have to charge some into prostitution, and law enforcement instead, when they had offer and acceptance that they observed, would offer the person a chance to go immediately into services in order to kind of enter a contract situation, like if you do this, then we won't charge. And that would be better, because even with a dismissal, you still have, which we ultimately do with our cases, assuming that the person complies, you still have that charge that shows up on their record, which could be another barrier to employment and housing and other things like that. So we want to try to move away ultimately from ever even charging when we don't have to. And again, that requires cooperation. It's a joint partnership basically with services and police department and the prosecuting office. And one last thing I'd like to say is for the prosecutors here and also the police, when you do get these cases for trial for sexual exploitation or patronizing, I've done those cases before, and there's some perception that they're very simple and easy to win. They're simple. You know, somebody makes an offer, somebody else makes an acceptance, boom, you're done, you proved it. But it's going to be different in different jurisdictions, and I'm not sure how it will be where you are. Where I am, you have a kind of an uphill battle because we actually experience jury nullification. We experience the attitude of, well, shouldn't be a crime, should it? It's just sex, it's just consenting adults, et cetera, et cetera. And in the misdemeanor world, at least in a busy jurisdiction, you don't have time to overcome that bias and that ignorance and that lack of education. You've got a couple minutes for your voir dire and a couple minutes for the closing. So what I've been working on over the last few months is really trying to expand the case at trial. Before, like I said, it was just a very short trial with one witness and very little testimony. But we've really made a lot of strides working cooperatively with the police department to get more evidence in. For example, copies of the ads that are placed, if it's a hotel operation, the statements of the buyers when they're arrested, and texts. Whenever you're doing an ad-based campaign, you've got texts coming in. And there's technology out there that can make those texts available to you, to the prosecutor, to the police, and to the juries, which can really take the case over the top. Because the juries want more. They want more than just a police officer saying, yeah, he offered to pay me for sex. They need more. And so we're developing that evidentiary area. So that's where we are now, and we have a long way to go. And it's an ongoing effort, not only to go up, but to stay up. Like you saw that one graph that Val showed where we had a dip in 2015 countywide. At that time, there were pressures from neighborhoods saying, you know, arrest these women that we see. And we saw a little bit of a diversion away from where we had been going and back to the typical historical method of going after the women. And we saw that reflected in the numbers, but we brought it back up. So it's a constant effort as we move slowly through the process of educating in all the sectors that need to be educated and to get on board with this type of effort. So what you could do, I would suggest to you, if you're interested in pursuing this, is first of all assess your own existing resources and your own existing policies. What are they and how would you want to change them? What resources can you bring to bear? If there are no resources, how can you get creative about that? How can you use the existing fee structures from the existing statutes to finance that effort that you may not be making already? You need to begin collaborations between particularly your prosecutor and your prosecuting and your office and your police officers, or rather your police department. You have to have that relationship going and a basic agreement to at least try this. but then you need to get on with your servicers as well as your courts and your public. You could think about changing your laws, think about creating, if your jurisdiction is big enough for a community court, because I do think that's very helpful to be able to send your prostituted people to one place where there's a judge that understands what's going on, and rather than scatter them out amongst different courtrooms. You can think about creating a group like we have, that we're fortunate to have in Seattle, the Buyer Beware Collaborative, which is prosecutors, NGOs, service providers, and technology and anti-slavery groups and businesses against slavery. That has really helped me. At first I was just a prosecutor working by myself to try to implement a policy that was just words on paper. But I have found that the collaboration between these other organizations and individuals has been invaluable. And I would highly recommend it as a model to help fuel the process in your communities. So those are my suggestions. Thank you.